Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and it is time for the latest installment of the Gaggle Film Club, where we select films not according to their supposed greatness, not according to whether the great and the good film critics deem the film worthy of watching, but according to whether we consider them interesting, entertaining, and of some instructional value for gagglers. Today's selection is an obscure film from Great Britain. It was made in 1951, and it has the melodramatic title High Treason. The film is a cracking thriller, and it concerns a communist cell in Great Britain. The film illustrates that Cold War anti-communist paranoia was not restricted to the cinema of Hollywood. British cinema also embraced it. The story concerns, as I say, a communist cell, huge. It penetrates every walk of society, from unions, sort of pubs, working class life, all the way through kind of middle class, doing slightly better, and then up to the upper crust of society. This communist cell is not just involved in spying, it's also involved in subversion and terrorism. The film is an absolutely cracking thriller, made in black and white, shot in location in London. So it presents a sort of nice picture of London in the 1950s. And it features a young man played by Kenneth Griffith. I think even if the name isn't familiar to gagglers, the moment they see him, they'll recognize him. He was a stalwart for many years of British cinema and, of course, television. So very, very well-known person. Here he is rather young. He naively gets involved with this communist cell, then tries to get out of it, and of course, it's not that easy to do. The film does away with the usual contrivances, which is so tedious of so many movies of that time, of having a narrator. There's a narrator. Every film starts with a narrator, somebody who has to tell us what's going on and why we are here and whatever. It's really annoying. Cinema is supposed to tell a story through images. It's not it's not supposed to be a kind of a poor man's novel. So, but this does away with it. It throws you into the action right away, which means that something that I rather enjoy with thrillers in particular, that you kind of have to figure out what's going on. A lot of things are happening which on the face of it seem incomprehensible, and it takes a little bit of time for you to figure out what's really going on. The director of this film is Roy Boulting. You may be familiar with the Boulting brothers. That's Roy and his twin brother John, and they made many movies during the 1950s and 60s. Some of them, Roy Boulting was the director, as in this case, and in some, he was the producer, while his twin brother John was the director. So they're responsible for really very good British comedies of the 50s and 60s. So you like Carlton Brown of the FO with Terry Thomas, Private's Progress, that also has Terry Thomas, and then of course I'm All Right, Jack, and so, these many of them are comedies. So it's kind of surprising that in this case that this is certainly not the comedy. The other interesting aspect of this, that the communist cell and the communists that are presented here in this film, and particularly since they're it isn't spelled out, but it's clear that they are working for the Soviet Union. They are known as illegals. Now, illegals in the espionage jargon means spies who don't have diplomatic cover. So they're engaged in stealing documents, relaying the documents to their masters in the Kremlin or wherever, but they don't have the diplomatic protection provided by embassies, consulates, trade missions, which means that they're really running a huge risk, because if they get caught and they get arrested, they face serious prison time. And interestingly, maybe about a year ago, Putin, who is of course a former KGB officer, paid tribute to the great illegals as, in a sense, heroes of the Soviet Union, because they risked everything to work for the Soviet Union. And one of the illegals that he mentioned was Konon Molody. Now, Konon Molody was better known as Gordon Lonsdale, and that was he was really the leader of the Portland spy ring, who basically stealing secrets from an underwater weapons lab in Portland, and relaying those secrets to the Soviets. They eventually were caught in the early 1960s, sentenced to hefty prison terms, including to Gordon Lonsdale, who later turned out to be Konon Molody. He was sentenced to 25 years, but he was released as part of a spy exchange program. So he was exchanged for Greville Wynne, who was a journalist who had basically taken the Penkovsky papers and relayed the Penkovsky papers to the CIA. And of course, he was arrested, sent to prison in the Soviet Union. So he was exchanged for Konon Molody, but Molody actually died quite young. But there was also the better-known case of Rudolf Abel, who was exchanged for it was exchanged for well, anyway, it was for Gary Powers. Gary Powers, of course, the U-2 pilot who was shot down because the Eisenhower administration was spying on Russia's nuclear capability, and particularly on how many long-range missiles the Soviet Union had. As part of an attempt to improve relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, Eisenhower had promised that there would be no more U-2 spy flights. But of course, as it often happens, the United States gives its word, and they continued with the U-2 spy flights. Of course, that was enraged Khrushchev. The U-2 was shot down. Gary Powers was then placed under arrest, and then he was exchanged for Rudolf Abel. And this, in fact, happened with the rest of the members of the Portland spy ring, that they were all gradually exchanged with various people that the Soviet Union had arrested. So in one case was Gerald Brooke, who was an English teacher. He was arrested. The Soviet Union sent to prison, I think, for 5 years, and then he was exchanged for the Krogers, who were better known. Their real name was Cohens, but they were known as the Krogers. They just basically acquired a fake name, and so they in exchange for Gerald Brooke, the Krogers were sent packing to the Soviet Union. But the point is, all these members of this Portland spy ring, they all ran a huge risk. They were all illegals, and when caught, they got hefty prison terms. So it's kind of interesting again that they present the illegals, but obviously they're here in this film They're a very powerful group. Um, and the other interesting thing is, as I said, uh, the spying, subversion, terrorism, whatever you call it, because they are involved, this cell, in plotting a big, a big terrorist operation. Um, but at the head of it all is somebody very upper crust, a real smoothie, talking with an upper crust accent, obviously very well off, very well born, been to the best schools, best universities, sailed into great jobs. He's now a member of parliament. And he's obviously the ringleader who are planning to take power on behalf of the communists. What's interesting about that is that this is 1951, and of course that was the year of the defection of Burgess and McLean. So the film was made really before anyone knew anything at all about Burgess and McLean. If Burgess and McLean were two Foreign Office officials who defected to the Soviet Union. But this was really, none of that was really known until about 1956. So what happened was that thanks to the Venona project, whereby they broke the Soviet codes, they kind of figured out, the British authorities gradually got to Donald McLean, who was in Washington. And Donald McLean was scheduled to be interrogated by British counterintelligence. And it was felt, whoever decided it, most historians assume that the person who had tipped off McLean that he was about to be interrogated by British counterintelligence was Kim Philby, and hence, Kim Philby was the third man. It's not clear that he was the third man, but he tipped off McLean, and then Guy Burgess, who was also essentially working for the Soviet Union, Guy Burgess joined McLean, and they both fled to the Soviet Union. Nobody knew exactly that they were the Soviet, that they were actually Soviet agents until some years later. And then the suspicions had grown that Kim Philby, and Kim Philby had a very senior position within British intelligence. He was head of the counterintelligence division of MI6. And essentially he had the same job as the legendary James Jesus Angleton had within the CIA. Angleton was headed counterintelligence within the CIA, and Angleton and Philby got on very well. Philby spent time in Washington. They partied, had dinners together, really enjoyed themselves. And when it basically turned out that Philby had, of course, all along been working for the Soviet Union, this caused a huge crisis in British-American relations, particularly British-American intelligence cooperation, something that basically it never really recovered after that. It was so traumatic. We talked, I think, a couple of weeks ago about that film from the 1980s, Whistleblower, where again this was this obsession that somehow the Americans don't trust us. They that we need to do whatever we can, walk over hot coal, grovel as much as we can, just to assure the Americans that they can indeed trust us. And so the story of Burgess, McLean, and Philby has been the stuff of innumerable plays, films, television shows, for an obvious reason. These were all wealthy, well-educated, upper crust Englishmen who for some reason chose to work for someone else. Essentially, to put it in an impolite way, they chose to betray their country, and betray their country that had done so well for them. I mean, these people were not poor, and that's something incidentally comes up in the film we're discussing today, High Treason, where the Kenneth Griffith character explains why he wanted to work with the communists, because he was poor, and he saw his mother scrimping and scaving and going without just in order to make sure that her two sons survive and are able to keep going in poverty. But Philby, Burgess, and McLean, of course, never had any of that. They went to Eton, Cambridge. They waltzed into one job, waltzed into another job. They never went without. So it was always kind of intriguing as to why would people who don't have anything to complain about, who enjoy such a good life, why would they want to betray their country? And so there's also, of course, the injustice of it all, which is that they were basically allowed to escape, and they all lived to a ripe old age. Well, not Burgess, of course. Burgess, who was, of course, very dissolute. He was, of course, gay, an alcoholic. He didn't last so very long. He died at a young age in Russia. But McLean and Philby, they lived very comfortably in the Soviet Union. All, died in old age. In the case of Philby, he lived long enough to see, the unraveling of the Gorbachev era. So he couldn't have been terribly happy to see all of that. Now, interestingly, in this film, there's a suggestion that the upper crust character is not going to get a lenient treatment, but the fact we know that all of these upper crust figures, including, of course, Anthony Blunt, who was the keeper of the Queen's pictures, had all manner of distinguished positions, who confessed to having worked for the Soviet Union for many years. He again was allowed to confess, and yet went on actually holding that position as the keeper of the Queen's pictures, and then died perfectly happily. Now, admittedly, by then he had been exposed, and the ignominy, and he was expelled from the British Academy. He had been a fellow of the British Academy, now he was out. But he didn't suffer what lower class, working class spies suffer. They get sent to prison. Those people don't get any breaks. And the members of this the Portland spy ring, the sort of the Gordon Lonsdales, the Krogers, and everything, they all went to prison for a long time. The only reason they were released after only a few years was that there was a spy exchange, that the Soviets got them out by releasing in turn British spies. So that's why I think that there remains this enduring fascination in Britain as to the famous Cambridge Five. Burgess, McLean, Philby, Anthony Blunt, and then another guy who's less well known, John Cairncross. I knew his brother a little bit, Alec Cairncross, while I worked at the Times Literary Supplement. And I didn't like him very much, but that's a different story. So this film is a very good thriller. It's a very good insight into the Britain of the 1950s. There's nothing fancy in it. There's no special effects. It's a workaday thriller, but I think one can find that it's these workaday thrillers that have aged best of all. You know, they come across as really, you know, going at a cracking pace. You know, there's no any irrelevant, no sidetracking or anything. There isn't a boring, pointless kind of love interest or anything else. You know, you just get right into it. You know, the investigation, the plots on the part of the communists. Interestingly enough, and I think this is something we've talked about at the film club, is that attitudes towards British intelligence changed very rapidly. So this was 1951, where British intelligence is, of course, presented in a very positive way, and you know, the communists obviously in very negatively. But you know, we've talked about The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. That's from the early 1960s. British intelligence is presented in a very unflattering light. Not that he's pro-communist; they're shown to be, you know, just as bad as the communists, but definitely no one to admire. And then, of course, the film I was talking about, the Whistleblower. They're really absolutely pathological and you know, and very destructive of Great Britain. So that's the selection for today's film. High Treason, 1951, starring Kenneth Griffith, directed by Roy Boulting. Try to catch it. And since it is Christmas Day, Merry Christmas, everybody. And we'll talk very soon. Everybody, have a great time. See you soon. Bye-bye.